The moment Wilhelmina Wells heard those words come out of Cody Marsh's mouth, she felt the ground shift beneath her boots like the earth itself had decided to betray her. "He watches you, Miss Wells, every single morning when you cross that yard to fetch your water. He watches you like a man watches a sunset he knows he does not deserve." She had been standing at the edge of the Trask property fence line, a bucket in each hand, her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years. The afternoon sun was pressing down on the Texas panhandle like a hot iron on dry cotton, and Cody Marsh, Samuel Trask's most trusted ranch hand, had ridden up beside her so quietly she had nearly dropped both buckets into the red dust. She turned to look at him. Cody was a lean man of 30, weathered and honest-faced, with eyes the color of creek water on a cloudy day. He was not a man who spoke without reason. "I beg your pardon," Wilhelmina said, her voice careful, controlled, the way she had learned to keep it since coming to Haskell County 2 years prior. "I know what I said," Cody replied simply. He adjusted the leather of his reins. "I figured it was time someone told you because that man in there is never going to tell you himself, and it would be a sin to let two people who could save each other from their own loneliness just keep circling around like fools." Wilhelmina's chest tightened. She set one of the buckets down in the dust and straightened up. She had spent the better part of 26 months convinced, absolutely and without question convinced, that Samuel Trask did not see her. Not truly. Not in the way a man sees a woman he might want in his life. She had told herself that a dozen times. She had repeated it like a prayer before sleep every night in the small wood-frame house she rented from old Doris Patton at the edge of town. She had used that certainty as armor. And now this ranch hand, this quiet, sun-darkened man on a brown horse, had just told her she had been wrong. The story of how Wilhelmina Wells came to be standing at that fence line, buckets in hand, heart cracking open like parched earth in a summer storm, began some 2.5 years earlier, in the autumn of 1882, when she stepped off a westbound train in Abilene, Texas with $43, a trunk of practical clothes, and a letter of employment from the Haskell County School Board. She had come from Missouri, from a small city called Hannibal, where she had spent 3 years teaching in a narrow schoolroom that smelled of chalk dust and old wood. She had been well regarded there. She had been something approaching content. But content was not the same as alive, and Wilhelmina Wells, who had always been more aware of the difference between those two states than most people around her, had answered an advertisement in the Hannibal Courier-Post one Tuesday morning over her breakfast coffee, and before the week was out, she had written a letter accepting a teaching position in a place called Driftwood Creek, Texas, a town so new it barely had a name worth printing on a map. She was 24 years old when she arrived. Her father was 3 years in the ground, taken by a fever that had swept through their street in the spring of 1879. Her mother had remarried a man named Garrett who was perfectly adequate in the practical sense and completely hollow in every other, and Wilhelmina had realized with a particular, quiet clarity that she did not belong in that house anymore, or in that city, or possibly in any place where people already knew the shape of her. So she had come west. Driftwood Creek was not what she had imagined, though she had tried to imagine very little in advance, knowing the imagination had a habit of making disappointments out of perfectly reasonable realities. The town sat on a flat stretch of the Texas Panhandle, where the sky was enormous and the wind was constant, and the people were the kind of hardworking, guarded, occasionally desperate individuals that frontier life tended to produce. There was a general store run by a man named Howard Price, a livery stable, a church with no regular minister, a doctor who came through on the 3rd Thursday of every month, and a 2-room schoolhouse that was Wilhelmina's domain from the first Monday of September 1882 onward. She was given a list of 22 students ranging from age 6 to 15, a crate of primers, 3 slates, and a box of chalk. She was told that the previous teacher, a young man named Fletcher, had left in April without explanation, and that the children had been running somewhat wild since. She was not told this as a warning so much as a fact, and she took it as such. Within a month, she had the schoolroom running the way she wanted it. She had a gift for the work, not merely the mechanical part of transmitting knowledge from one mind to another, but the deeper part, the business of earning the trust of young people who had learned early that the world did not always hold steady under their feet. She was firm without being harsh. She was warm without being soft. The children of Driftwood Creek, most of them the sons and daughters of ranchers and laborers and a few of mixed Apache and white heritage, whose particular position in the town's social fabric was complicated and often unjust in ways Wilhelmina noticed and quietly refused to accept, came to trust her. It was through these children that she first became aware of Samuel Trask. The Trask Ranch was the largest operation in Haskell County, some 6,000 acres of grassland and mesquite that Samuel had inherited at the age of 28 from his father, Eli Trask, who had broken the land and built the house and died of a heart that gave out one morning in the paddock without giving any warning. That had been in 1880. Samuel was 30 when Wilhelmina arrived, though she would not learn his exact age until much later. His 2 children were in her schoolhouse. Clara was 9, dark-eyed and careful, a girl who held her pencil with great concentration and asked questions that were 3 years ahead of where they should have been. Thomas was 7, red-cheeked and loud, with a gap between his front teeth and a laugh that could fill a room. They were both clearly bright, clearly loved, and clearly being raised by a father who was doing his utmost in circumstances that were not easy. Samuel Trask's wife had died in the spring of 1881, 14 months before Wilhelmina's arrival, from a fever that had taken hold after the birth of a 3rd child who did not survive. There was no particular drama in how Wilhelmina learned this. Doris Patton, her landlady, told her in the practical way that frontier women tended to discuss hard facts, as simple events that had occurred and been survived, and were now part of the landscape of things one lived among. Her name had been Ruth. She had been kind and capable. Samuel had loved her completely. That was all Doris said, and Wilhelmina had heard the weight in that last sentence and had not pressed. She met Samuel Trask for the first time at the end of September, at a gathering the town held in front of the general store to mark the end of the harvest season. It was not a formal occasion. People brought food and the Price brothers played fiddles, and there was cider from a barrel, and everyone stood around in the cooling evening air and talked about the summer just gone and the winter coming and the small ordinary business of lives being lived. Samuel arrived with Clara on one side and Thomas on the other, a tall man with the particular kind of lean, deliberate physicality that came from years of physical labor done consistently and without complaint. He had dark hair that was just beginning to show its first gray at the temples, a jaw that suggested a certain stubbornness, and eyes that Wilhelmina, when she finally looked at them directly, found to be the precise color of the sky at the moment just before full dark, that deep, ambiguous blue that was almost gray and almost violet and belonged to no clean category. She introduced herself. He shook her hand. He said he was glad the children had a good teacher and that Clara had come home talking about fractions, and that was something of a miracle because Clara had previously shown no interest in numbers whatsoever. Wilhelmina said she was glad to be there. He nodded. That was the whole of it. He moved away to speak with Howard Price about something to do with cattle prices, and Wilhelmina stood with Doris and watched the children run in the dry grass and told herself, in the reasonable, sensible part of her mind, that there was nothing to think about. But she thought about him. She thought about him in the way a person thinks about a word they cannot quite remember, something that hovers at the edge of attention without becoming anything solid. She noticed the way he moved through a room, or through a gathering like this one, with a kind of contained purposefulness that suggested he was always aware of exactly where his children were. She noticed that he did not say unnecessary things. She noticed that when he laughed, which was not often, it was genuine and brief, and changed his whole face. She told herself this was idle observation. She told herself she was a woman alone in a new place, and naturally her mind sought points of interest. She told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that Samuel Trask was a man still deep in his grief, that he was a father with 2 children to raise, that he was her employer in the indirect but real sense that the ranching families of Haskell County were the ones whose taxes funded the school board that paid her salary, and that none of these observations she was making constituted anything worth naming. And she believed these things. She truly believed them. Because nothing in his manner toward her gave her any reason to believe otherwise. He was not cold. He was not unkind. On the 2 occasions that first year when he came to the schoolroom to speak with her about his children's progress, he was attentive and earnest and asked good questions. He thanked her properly. He looked her in the eye. But there was nothing in any of it that she could hold up and say, this is a thing between the 2 of us specifically. It was the behavior of a good father, nothing more. The second year began much like the first, and Wilhelmina settled into Driftwood Creek in the way that a person settles when they have decided that a place is worthy of their effort. She joined the church's informal women's auxiliary, not because she was particularly devout, but because it was the organization through which things in the town actually got done, the kind of quiet, practical, unglamorous work that women performed while the men had their town council meetings and congratulated themselves on their decisions. She organized a small lending library out of her schoolroom, stocking it with books she wrote for from a bookseller in Abilene. She learned to bake a decent sourdough because flour and time were both available, and she began to find a kind of satisfaction in that, in the physical work of making something that fed people. She crossed Samuel Trask's property line twice each day. This was not by design, or rather, it was by necessity that had become habit. The shortest path between her house and the school crossed the corner of the Trask land, following a well-worn trail past the northern fence line and then cutting across the open ground to the schoolhouse road. Samuel had never objected to this. Several of the townspeople used similar paths across his land, and he was not the type of man who made issues of things that were not issues, but it meant she saw him sometimes. In the early mornings when he was already working, moving between the barn and the paddock or speaking with his hands near the fence. In the late afternoons, when she walked back, he was sometimes in the yard, and he would raise a hand in acknowledgement and she would nod, and that was the entirety of their daily exchange. She had become, she realized, one of those women who constructed a complete internal story around a series of entirely ordinary interactions and then berated herself regularly for having done so. It was not romantic in the novel's and petticoat sense. It was more like a persistent low-level attentiveness, the way one might be especially aware of a particular piece of music without admitting that it had become important. She was aware of him. She noticed his presence and his absence. She did not, she told herself, expect anything from this. She did not, she told herself, want anything from this. He was in mourning, he was occupied, he was not looking at her. She was certain of that last point. She built the whole defensive architecture of her unexpressed feeling on that certainty. He did not notice her, not in the way that mattered. And because he did not notice her, she was safe to feel what she felt in the privacy of her own chest without any danger of it becoming something that had to be dealt with. And then Cody Marsh rode up beside her on a Wednesday afternoon in late April of 1884 and told her she had been wrong. She picked the bucket back up and stood there in the afternoon light looking at Cody Marsh and trying to organize her thoughts into something that was not trembling. "How long?" she said finally. Cody tilted his head. "How long has he been watching?" "Yes." Cody considered the question with what appeared to be genuine care. "About as long as you've been crossing that yard, I reckon, though he'd fire me outright if he knew I'd said a word of it." "Then why are you telling me?" The ranch hand was quiet for a moment. A crow called from somewhere in the mesquite. The wind moved through the dry grass. "Because I've worked for Samuel Trask for 4 years," Cody said. "And in that time I've watched him take a grief that would have broken most men and carry it without complaint, and hold his children up through it, and keep 3,000 cattle from dying in 2 bad droughts, and not ask for anything from anybody. And now for the last year and a half, I have watched him look at you with the exact same expression he used to have when he was looking at something he decided he could not afford. And I have decided that is a kind of suffering I am not required to stand by and observe in silence." Wilhelmina looked out across the flat land toward the Trask house, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and a barn to the west and the paddocks beyond that. The evening light was making everything gold and long-shadowed. "He might simply respect me as a teacher," she said, but even as she said it she heard how thin it sounded. "Miss Wells," Cody said, very patiently, "the man has sat on his front porch every morning for the past year and a half with his coffee and watched you walk by. He does not do this for any teacher. He does this because you have gotten under his skin in a way he does not know what to do with, and because Samuel Trask is the most stubborn, most self-denying man I have ever had the misfortune to admire." Wilhelmina did not say anything for a long time. The crow called again. Thomas Trask appeared at the far end of the yard, chasing something in the dust, laughing. "What am I supposed to do with that information?" she asked. "That," said Cody Marsh, "is entirely your own business." He touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and rode back toward the barn. Wilhelmina stood at the fence line for a long moment. Then she picked up both buckets and walked home. That night she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. She forgot to drink and thought about the particular texture of her certainty that Samuel Trask had not noticed her, and how that certainty had functioned less like a fact and more like a fortress. She had built herself inside it. She had arranged her daily life around it. Every morning she had crossed that yard with her eyes forward, had nodded when she saw him, had kept her voice neutral and her manner professional, and had congratulated herself on her restraint and her practicality and her absolute absence of delusion. And it had been a kind of lie. Not the lie that she felt nothing. The lie that the feeling was entirely one-sided. She did not sleep well. The next morning she crossed the yard the same way she always did, because she was a practical woman and her children needed their teacher and the world did not pause for the rearrangement of a person's internal certainties. She kept her eyes forward, but she noticed, as she passed the house, that the front porch was occupied. Samuel Trask was sitting in the wooden chair to the right of the door, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching the sunrise. He was in his work clothes, the dark trousers and the worn flannel shirt with the sleeves already rolled, the hat sitting on the railing beside him. He looked like a man who had been awake for some time. When he heard her boots on the path, he turned. She nodded, he nodded. And then, because something in her had shifted overnight and she could not quite put it back into place, she slowed her step by a fraction, not a full stop, not an invitation, just a fraction, a small offering of extra time. He noticed. She could see him notice. Something moved through his expression, something careful and almost startled, like a man who has heard his name called in a voice he was not expecting. She kept walking. But that evening, on her way home, when she passed the yard again, Clara was sitting on the porch steps with a book and called out to her about something they had been reading in school. And Wilhelmina stopped, and they talked about it for a few minutes. And Samuel came out of the house onto the porch partway through and stood there listening. And when Clara went inside to help with the supper, Samuel and Wilhelmina were left standing in the golden light of the early evening with approximately 10 feet of yard between them. "She's been reading that book for 3 days, he said. "She finished it in 2, Wilhelmina said. "She has been reading it a second time." Something came into his expression that was unmistakably warm. "She didn't tell me that. She might not have wanted to seem immodest." He considered that. "She is exactly like her mother," he said, and then something crossed his face, a brief shadow, not painful exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a long familiar ache that had become part of the landscape rather than an interruption of it. "She is remarkable," Wilhelmina said simply. Both of them are. You should be proud." "I am," he said. Every day, he looked at her then directly with those deep sky eyes. "You have a lot to do with that, Miss Wells. Children come to learning on their own terms," she said. "I just hold the door open." "Still," he said. "Still," she thought. The word settled somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She said good night. He said good night. She walked home in the long last light of the day and did not berate herself at all for the warmth she felt, because it had been given to her, directly and without ambiguity, and she was allowed to hold it. The following weeks moved forward with the particular quality of things that are beginning to change but have not yet declared themselves. Wilhelmina's morning walks past the Trask house became something she was aware of in a different way than she had been before. Not anxious, not performatively casual, but present. She was present to them in a way she had not allowed herself to be. And Samuel was on his porch most mornings, and they exchanged words now, brief words about the weather or the children or something one of the ranchers had mentioned about the coming season. Nothing that could be examined too closely, but words, more of them, accumulating. Then in early May the trouble started. The trouble came in the form of a man named Gerald Fitch, who arrived in Driftwood Creek on a Thursday with 3 other men, and a claim that he held a prior deed to the northeastern section of the Trask grazing land, a section that ran some 900 acres along the creek bed, and which Samuel's cattle depended on through the dry summer months. Gerald Fitch was a man in his mid-40s, heavy-set and careful, in a way that suggested he had experience making things difficult for people through legal means rather than physical ones. He had a lawyer with him, a pale, soft-handed man named Aldrich who carried a leather case full of papers and spoke in a language designed to confuse rather than clarify. Their claim was that Eli Trask had purchased the creek land from a man named Davis in 1874, but that Davis had already sold that same land to a company registered in Fort Worth in 1873, and that the subsequent sale to Eli was therefore invalid, and that the Fort Worth company, which Fitch now controlled through a series of transactions he was willing to document, held the rightful deed. Samuel heard this claim in Howard Price's general store, where Fitch had come to make his announcement to the widest possible immediate audience, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that Wilhelmina, who had stopped in for flour and happened to be standing near the back of the gathering, watched with close attention. There was disbelief first, then something cold and calculating, then a controlled fury that he pressed down into perfect stillness. "My father bought that land legally," Samuel said. His voice was quiet and absolutely flat. "The documents suggest otherwise," Aldrich the lawyer said. "Then someone forged documents," Samuel said. "Because I have my father's original deed and it is in order." Fitch smiled pleasantly. "Courts in this territory have ruled on this kind of competing claim before, Mr. Trask. I'm sure you'd prefer to resolve this without a legal fight, particularly one you might not win." The implicit threat in that last sentence was clear to everyone in the room. Samuel looked at Fitch for a long moment. "Get off my land," he said simply, and walked out. The story moved through the town with the speed that stories moved in small frontier settlements, which was immediately and everywhere at once. By sundown, everyone in Driftwood Creek had an opinion. A few of the ranchers, men who had known Eli Trask personally, were outraged. Others were more circumspect, not wanting to align themselves against a man with lawyers. Howard Price, who had a gift for neutrality that served him well in business, said carefully that these things were best left to the legal system, which was not particularly helpful. Wilhelmina sat with Doris Patton that evening and listened to the older woman's account of what she knew about the original land purchase, which was considerable since Doris had been in Haskell County longer than almost anyone. "Eli bought that creek land fair," Doris said. "I remember it. Davis was a drinker who got himself into debt and sold off parcels to cover it. He sold to Eli, I know he did, because Eli came and told my husband about it, said he finally had the water rights secured. That would have been in the spring of 1874. Is there anyone else who would remember? Wilhelmina asked. Old Jim Carraway might. He was Davis's nearest neighbor, but Jim moved up to New Mexico 3 years ago. Wilhelmina was quiet, thinking. She had no particular expertise in land law, but she had a very good mind for the ordered structure of evidence and argument, and something about the nature of Fitch's claim troubled her. The claim was not that the sale to Eli had not occurred. The claim was that a prior sale rendered it invalid. That meant that if the prior sale could be shown to be fraudulent, or if the Fort Worth Company could be shown to have known about the subsequent transaction and had not acted on its supposed rights in the 10 intervening years, the whole foundation of Fitch's case might crack. She was not a lawyer, but she could read, and she knew how to research, and she had contacts in Abilene through the school board who might know something about Fort Worth land registry records. She did not make any decision that evening. She went home and went to bed. The next morning she crossed the yard and Samuel was on the porch with his coffee, but he looked like a man who had not slept, and the lines around his eyes were deeper than they usually were, and his jaw was set in that way she had come to recognize as his anger held very tightly under control. She stopped. "How are you?" she asked, not in the passing social way, in the real way. He looked at her and she could see him consider the reflexive fine, the default response, and then decide against it. "I'm not good," he said simply. "That land is what keeps my cattle alive in July and August. Without the creek access, I lose a third of my operation at minimum, maybe more." "I've been thinking about the claim," she said, "the structure of it." He looked at her differently then, not the warm look from before, but something sharper, more alert. "What do you mean?" "May I sit for a moment?" He stood up and gestured to the second chair on the porch, the one that had been empty every morning she had passed, and she sat down across from him in the morning light and told him what she had been turning over in her mind. He listened completely. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "The Fort Worth Company never acted on the land. 10 years. They never sent anyone, never paid the county assessment, nothing." "Do you have records of who paid the county assessment?" "I paid it every year since my father died. And before that, my father paid it every year from 1874. "That is significant," Wilhelmina said. "A company that holds a legitimate deed to land does not allow another party to pay the county assessment for 10 years without objection. Their silence is itself a form of evidence." Samuel looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. Not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. More like recognition. The expression of a man who has just discovered that someone he already thought well of is, in fact, someone he should think about even more carefully. "I need to get to Abilene," he said. "I need to see the land registry records myself." "I can help with that," she said. "I have a contact at the school board office there, a woman named Harriet Crane who has access to county records. I can write her today." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why would you do that?" The question was not suspicious. It was genuine, the question of a man who had been largely alone in his problems for a long time and was not accustomed to offers of assistance. "Because it is the right thing," Wilhelmina said. "And because your children are in my schoolroom every day, and I would very much like them to grow up on this land." He held her gaze for what was probably 3 seconds but felt considerably longer. "Thank you," he said, and she heard something in his voice that was not ordinary gratitude, something with more weight behind it. She went and wrote the letter to Harriet Crane that morning before her students arrived. She told Harriet she needed any records relating to a Fort Worth Land Company's filed deed on a Haskell County parcel dated 1873, and any record of county assessment payments on that parcel for the past decade. She sent it on the afternoon post. In the meantime, the situation with Fitch was not static. He was making himself visible in the town, eating at the eating house, speaking with people, being pleasant in the way that certain kinds of dangerous men are pleasant when they are establishing themselves before they strike. One of his associates, a compact, hard-faced man named Briggs, was seen riding the perimeter of the creek land. which was still legally the Trask property until any court said otherwise, and which he had no right to be on. Samuel was informed of this and rode out to confront Briggs personally. Cody Marsh told Wilhelmina about it the next day, matter-of-factly, and she felt something cold move through her at the thought of Samuel alone on the creek land with one of Fitch's men. Was there trouble? She asked. Briggs backed down, Cody said. Samuel has that effect on people when he wants to. She believed it. She had seen the quality that allowed Samuel Trask to walk out of a confrontation in Howard Price's store and leave a room full of people feeling that the matter was settled, at least morally, regardless of what the law might eventually say. Harriet Crane's reply came 8 days later. It was thorough, because Harriet was a thorough woman who had been keeping county records for 15 years and had a deep distrust of imprecision. The Fort Worth Company, registered under the name Western Pasture Holdings, had filed a deed claim on the creek parcel in September 1873. The company had then made precisely no further administrative action. They had not paid a single county assessment. They had not filed any claim of adverse possession. They had not sent any representative to the county office. For 10 years, 11 by the time of Fitch's appearance, they had been entirely absent. Furthermore, Harriet had gone one step further and made some inquiries with a colleague in the Fort Worth land office. Western Pasture Holdings had dissolved as a registered entity in 1876 after failing to file its annual papers. When the company dissolved, its assets should have been formally transferred or the claims should have been vacated. There was no record of a formal transfer of the creek land deed to any subsequent entity. What that meant, in plain language, was that Gerald Fitch's claim to represent the company's interests was built on a foundation of nothing. The company did not exist anymore, and the deed had never been properly maintained. Wilhelmina read the letter twice, then picked up her skirts and walked directly to the Trask ranch without thinking about whether this was the appropriate time or whether she was being too forward or any of the other small social restraints she usually applied to her own behavior. She found Samuel in the paddock with Cody, working on a fence section, and called to him, and he came to the fence and she held out the letter. He read it standing at the fence rail, his hat in his hand. She watched his face change as he read. The tightness around his jaw loosened. Something in his shoulders came down a fraction. "This is everything," he said. "This is enough for a lawyer to make a very solid case," she said carefully. "I don't want to promise too much, but the dissolution of the company and the failure to transfer the deed, combined with 10 years of your family paying the county assessment without any challenge, that is a very strong position." He looked up from the letter. The afternoon sun was full on his face. "You did this," he said. "You found this." "I wrote a letter," she said. "Harriet Crane did the real work." "You wrote the letter," he repeated, with an emphasis that made it mean more than the literal action. He held her gaze and she held his, and for a moment the fence and the paddock and the afternoon and everything else was very simple and very clear. Cody, somewhere behind Samuel, was engaged in a piece of fence work that seemed to require a great deal of his focused attention in the opposite direction. "I'll take this to a lawyer in Abilene this week," Samuel said. He folded the letter carefully and looked at her again. "Miss Wells, I don't know how to properly say what this means to me." "You don't have to say it," she said. "I'm just glad it helps." He nodded. And then, unexpectedly, he said, "Would you walk with me after supper tonight, along the north fence? I'd like to talk." Not about the land, just to talk. Her heart did something it had not done in a long time, something it had been carefully not doing for 2.5 years. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They walked that evening in the long Texas dusk when the sky was doing everything it knew how to do with color, the kinds of pinks and golds and deep purples that made you understand why people had always built religions around sunsets. They walked along the north fence line, where the mesquite trees cast long shadows and the dry grass whispered in the wind, and they talked. He asked her about Missouri, about what she had left there, and she told him honestly. She told him about her father's death and her mother's remarriage to the adequate and hollow Mr. Garrett, and about the particular specific loneliness of being a person who fit perfectly into the outline that life had made for her, but not into the life itself. He listened without trying to fix anything or offer remedies. He just listened, which was rarer than she had been led to expect from people. She asked him about the ranch, not about the trouble with Fitch, but about the work itself, about what it meant to him. And he told her things she had not expected. He told her that his father had been a difficult man, demanding and not warm, and that he had come to love the land not because it had been given to him as a gift, but because he had earned his relationship with it through 10 years of breaking himself against it, and discovering that he was stronger than he had thought. He told her that after Ruth died, he had walked the fence lines at night sometimes, for months, just to have something physical to do with his body while his mind would not be still. "The children kept me here," he said. "I don't mean that in a dramatic way, I mean it practically. They needed feeding in the morning, and they needed someone to hear their prayers at night, and those two things were enough to build a day around when nothing else was." She thought about the specific gravity of that sentence. The way love in its most demanding form was also its most sustaining form. She thought about her own solitude, which had been, she realized, a choice she had made to keep herself safe from that kind of gravity, because she had been afraid of needing something that could be taken away. "You have done a remarkable job," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know about remarkable. I just did the only things I knew how to do." They had stopped walking, she realized. They were standing near the corner of the north fence where the creek bed ran dry in summer, the spot where she had been standing when Cody Marsh had turned her understanding of things upside down. The sky above them was doing its deepening thing, the blue going darker, the first stars appearing. "I owe Cody Marsh an apology," she said, before she quite knew she was going to say it. Samuel turned to look at her. "For what?" "For thinking for a very long time that you didn't notice me." She said it simply, looking forward at the darkening sky rather than at him, which made it easier. "I built a great deal on that certainty." It turns out it was incorrect. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something being set down and examined. "Cody talked to you," Samuel said. "It was not a question." "He did." Another silence. "I should probably be angry with him." "Probably," she agreed. "Are you?" He was quiet for so long that she finally turned to look at him. His face in the near dark was open in a way she had not seen before, the habitual reserve that he carried like a second skin temporarily absent, and what she saw underneath was something that had been waiting for a considerable amount of time. "No," he said. She breathed. "Neither am I." He looked at her. She looked at him. The first night wind came across the grass, cool and carrying the smell of dry earth and distance. "I have been trying to talk myself out of this for a long time," he said. "I convinced myself it was not fair, to Ruth's memory, to you, to the children, that a man with my kind of obligations had no right to ask anything of anyone." "That is a very generous act of self-denial," Wilhelmina said quietly. "That mostly punishes the wrong people." Something moved through his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "You have a very clear way of seeing things." "I have a clear way of seeing other people's things," she said. "My own things I have been considerably less clear about." He reached out then, carefully, and his hand covered hers where it rested on the fence rail. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a sweeping, romantic declaration. It was a hand placed over another hand in the gathering dark, and it carried in it every morning coffee and every nodded greeting and every word exchanged at a school porch and every careful, patient, held-back feeling that had been building in both of them for 2.5 years, and it was enough to make the whole wide Texas sky feel very close and very certain. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you would want." "It is something I would want," she said. His hand tightened slightly over hers. They stood there in the quiet for a while longer, watching the stars come out one by one, neither of them in any particular hurry. The courtship of Wilhelmina Wells and Samuel Trask was not a rushed affair, partly because neither of them was by nature a person who rushed toward things they valued, and partly because there was the matter of Fitch's legal claim, which did not go away simply because Wilhelmina had found Harriet Crane's letter. Samuel took the documents to a lawyer in Abilene named Guthrie, who was known throughout the county for his tenacity and his dislike of fraudulent dealings, and Guthrie read the papers and said what Wilhelmina had said, that it was a strong position, stronger than he had expected, and that he would file the appropriate responses and challenge Fitch's claim directly. Fitch, when he learned that the challenge was coming, revealed more of his hand. He went to see Samuel at the ranch, accompanied by Aldrich the lawyer and Briggs the hard-faced associate, and what he said in that meeting, which Cody overheard from the barn and reported to Wilhelmina 2 days later with tight-jawed anger, was that he had friends in the county assessor's office who could make paperwork disappear and reappear in ways that might be very inconvenient for the Trask claim, and that Samuel might find it easier in the long run to settle for a fair purchase price on the creek land, rather than fight a legal battle that could drag on for years and cost more than the land was worth. It was, stripped of its polite language, a bribe combined with a threat. Samuel had told him to leave. Wilhelmina heard this and felt something very cold settle in her stomach, not fear for herself, but the particular cold anger that came from watching an injustice being committed against someone she cared about. She went to see Guthrie herself, riding the post wagon to Abilene on a Saturday, and told him what she knew about Fitch's threat regarding the county assessor. Guthrie, who was a lean man with very little humor but a ferocious sense of professional dignity, took careful notes and said this changed the nature of the matter considerably. What Fitch had described was attempted corruption, which was a matter for the district court, and a man who was attempting corruption was often a man with other things to hide. He asked her, with evident curiosity, what her connection to the Trask case was. She told him she was a friend of the family. He looked at her with the evaluating look of a man who assessed evidence for a living and said simply, "I see," which she chose not to examine too carefully. The legal matter moved through July and into August with the grinding pace of frontier jurisprudence, which was never fast but which was occasionally thorough. Guthrie filed his challenge. Fitch's lawyer filed a response. The district judge in Abilene, a man named Holloway who had a reputation for impatience with wasted time, scheduled a hearing for the first week of September. Meanwhile, the courtship continued in the way that courtships did on the Texas frontier, which is to say, with much more practical content than a person raised on romantic novels might have expected, and also, unexpectedly, with a kind of emotional richness that practical content and romantic feeling were not actually incompatible. Samuel came to the schoolroom one Saturday morning, when there were no children, and helped Wilhelmina mend the roof corner that had begun to let in light after a windstorm in June, and they spent 3 hours up on the roof together in the bright morning while she handed him shingles and he nailed them down, and they talked about everything and nothing, about books and weather, and what each of them had wanted from life when they were younger, and what they thought about that now. She told him that she had once wanted to study law and had been told by 3 separate people that this was not a realistic ambition for a woman in her position, and she saw something particular move through his face at that, an anger on her behalf that she had not expected, and which moved her more than she could quite account for. They were wrong, he said simply. He was holding a shingle in one hand and looking at her with complete directness. You have a clearer legal mind than most men I've met. That is a generous thing to say. It's just what's true, he said. I don't have a lot of use for saying things that aren't true. She had come to understand this about him. It was, she thought, one of the most reliable things about him. He did not perform. He did not say what seemed expected. He said what he believed, and when he believed something about her, he said it in exactly the same tone he would use to say that the sky was blue or that the west pasture needed mending, as if it were simple fact, as if it had never occurred to him that she might not believe it. Clara and Thomas were aware of the situation in the way that children who are paying close attention, are always aware of the important things happening around them. Clara, who was 11 now and reading at a level that would have impressed students 4 years her senior, watched Wilhelmina with an expression of careful evaluation that felt oddly like being tested by a person you very much wanted to pass. Thomas, who was 9 and largely operated on instinct and loyalty, had simply absorbed the new reality with his characteristic directness, and one afternoon informed Wilhelmina that she made better biscuits than the woman who came to cook on Tuesdays, which she took as the highest endorsement available to him. She began to understand in those summer months what it would mean to love these children not as a teacher loves her students, which she already did, but as something more permanent and more claiming. It was not a small thing. It was not a simple thing. Clara's mother Ruth existed in the house in ways both visible and invisible, in the small photograph on the parlor shelf, and in the way Clara sometimes went quiet and looked at something far away and came back from wherever she had gone with a steadiness that was beyond her years. Wilhelmina did not try to move into any space that was not offered to her. She did not attempt to be anything other than what she was. She was Wilhelmina Wells, who loved these children and was coming to love their father, and she held that quietly and let it find its own shape. The September hearing came. Samuel went to Abilene for 3 days. Cody ran the ranch in his absence with the efficient competence of a man who had been doing so informally for years. Wilhelmina taught her classes, and in the evening sat on Doris's porch and tried not to watch the road for the post wagon. He came back on the 4th day, late afternoon, and she was crossing the yard with her water buckets, and she looked up and he was riding in through the main gate, and the look on his face told her before he said a single word. She set the buckets down. He dismounted and walked to her, and he was smiling, which was not something she had seen him do without reservation before, the controlled partial smile she had come to know, yes, but not this, not the whole of it. Guthrie won, he said. The judge ruled that the Western Pasture Holdings deed was abandoned by dissolution and non-action. My father's original purchase stands. The creek land is mine. And then something happened that she had not fully prepared herself for, which was that Samuel Trask, who was a man who did not perform and who held the line on his own feelings with the same dedication he held his property line, stepped forward and put his arms around her, and held her with the full weight of his relief and his gratitude and something beyond both of those things. And she put her arms around him and felt the solid certainty of him, all that contained, purposeful, unperforming strength. And it was one of the most honest moments she had ever stood inside. They stood like that in the yard while the afternoon light went golden around them, and the horses in the paddock moved peacefully in the distance, and somewhere in the house, Thomas was making noise that suggested he had discovered something interesting in the kitchen. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly into her hair, "for the letter, for Abilene, for all of it. The land is yours," she said. "It was always yours." He drew back to look at her, and there was so much in his face that she did not try to catalog it. She just looked at it. "Stay for supper," he said. She stayed for supper. She stayed for supper that evening and the next Saturday and the one after that. And somewhere in those months, the question of what she was to this family and this house stopped being something she considered from the outside and became something she was simply inside of, in the way that you can be standing in a room for a long time before you fully recognize that it is yours. One October evening, when the nights had begun to carry the first cool edge of autumn and the children were in bed and they were sitting on the porch with the lantern lit between them, Samuel said, without preamble, the way he said most important things, "I want to ask you to marry me. I want to ask you properly. But I want to know first whether you have thought about what it means, not just you and me, what it means for you to come here to this house, to these children. I want to know that you have thought about it." She looked at him across the lantern light. She thought about a woman in Missouri who had been content but not alive. She thought about a westbound train and $43 and a letter of employment, and 2.5 years of building a life in a place she had been afraid to claim completely. "I have thought about it," she said. "Since before you were asking me to, I have been thinking about it." She paused. "I love your children, Samuel. I love them as fully as I know how. And I know that they have a mother and she is not me, and I have never wanted to be her and I would never try to be. But I can love them in the way that I love them, which is the only way I have, and I believe that is something rather than nothing." He looked at her steadily. "It is considerably more than something." "Then yes," she said. "Ask me." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a ring, a plain gold band with a small oval turquoise stone set in it. And she recognized in this choice something absolutely characteristic of him. No performance, no excess, just something real and solid and particular. The stone the color of the sky they sat under every evening on this porch. "Wilhelmina Wells," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it in the lantern light and then looked at him, and he was looking at her the way Cody Marsh had described. The way a man looks at a sunset he does not think he deserves, and she thought, "You do deserve this, and I am going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure you know it." They were married in the Driftwood Creek Church on the 3rd Saturday of November 1884, which was cold and bright, and the whole sky was the deep clear blue of November in the Texas Panhandle. The church had a minister now, a young man named Beaumont who had arrived in September and was earnest in his faith and sensible in his manner, and he conducted the ceremony with a straightforwardness that suited both Samuel and Wilhelmina perfectly. Howard Price stood up for Samuel. Doris Patton stood with Wilhelmina. Clara and Thomas sat in the front pew, and Clara cried, not from sadness, she explained afterward with great precision, but because things that were right sometimes made her cry, and this was right. Thomas ate 3 of the celebration biscuits before anyone was looking and was not repentant. Cody Marsh stood in the back of the church, and when Wilhelmina caught his eye during the ceremony, he touched the brim of his hat in that same gesture. He had made it the fence line 7 months earlier, and she very nearly laughed out loud in the middle of her wedding. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, the big table in the kitchen that sat 12, and the extra planks set up in the hall for the overflow. Doris brought her pickled vegetables. Howard Price brought a bottle of bourbon that he said he had been saving for a good occasion. The school board women brought pies. Someone brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the cleared space of the parlor while the November wind moved outside and the lanterns made everything warm and gold. At one point in the evening, Samuel found her standing apart for a moment, watching the dancing, and he came and stood beside her and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that watching their neighbors and their children and their friends fill the house with noise and warmth and life. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered the difference between content and alive, the distinction she had made to herself years ago in a house in Missouri, the distinction that had driven her west and into a schoolroom and past a fence line every morning and into this moment. "Yes," she said, "entirely." He pressed a kiss against her hair. "Good," he said simply. "Me too." The first years of their marriage had the quality of a house being completed, not in any sense that it had been unfinished before, but in the way that something built to be lived in becomes more itself the more fully it is occupied. Wilhelmina brought her books and her sourdough starter and her particular habit of waking before dawn and sitting with her tea in the kitchen thinking before anyone else was up, and these things settled into the life of the house as if they had always been there. She kept teaching. She had not been asked to give it up and had not offered to, and Samuel had said once, early in their engagement, that he had not married her in order to remove her from work that was important to her, which she had taken as one of the more intelligent things a man could say, and had added it to her considerable store of evidence that she had chosen well. The children adjusted to the new shape of things with a combination of grace and pragmatism that was entirely characteristic of both of them. Clara continued to read everything she could obtain, and Wilhelmina, and she had long, serious conversations about literature and mathematics, and the nature of the world in general that Samuel would sometimes sit in on with his coffee, listening with the attentive expression of a man who was being educated in something he had not known he was missing. Thomas became, over time, a boy who could fix things, who had an instinctive understanding of mechanical problems, and a patience with tools that was slightly miraculous given his general energy level. He followed Cody around the ranch learning everything Cody would teach him, and Cody, who had no children of his own, taught him everything. The town grew. The railroad extended a spur line to within 20 miles of Driftwood Creek in 1886, which changed the character of commerce in the region significantly. New families arrived. The school enrollment grew from 22 to 31, and then to 40, and Wilhelmina had to petition the school board for an additional room and eventually an assistant, a young woman named Mabel Holt who had come from Dallas, and who was sharp and energetic and good with the youngest children in particular. Fitch did not return. Guthrie had forwarded the evidence of his attempted corruption to the district judge, who had passed it to the appropriate legal authority, and the last Wilhelmina heard, which was through Guthrie's occasional correspondence, was that Fitch was involved in a separate legal matter in Fort Worth that was keeping him very occupied. She did not think about him often. The creek land remained as it had always been, the Trask cattle watering there through the summer, the grass green around it while the surrounding land went gold and dry. In the spring of 1886, Wilhelmina told Samuel that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, in the quiet before the house woke, when she was at the table with her tea, and he came in from checking the morning and poured his coffee and sat across from her. She said it simply and directly, the way she had come to say all important things. He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his coffee down and reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them and did not say anything for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice was different from its usual quality, quieter, carrying something that was either careful or reverent or both. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said, "I feel well," and she did. She was 30 years old and healthy, and she was not going to borrow fear from the future because of what had happened to Ruth. She had thought about that. She had made a deliberate, considered decision about it. She was not going to let the shadow of that loss take anything from this. He seemed to understand this without needing it explained. He held her hands and looked at her with those deep sky eyes, and she looked back, and between them was a full and clear and unclouded joy. "Clara and Thomas will want to know," she said. "They will be beside themselves," he said, and then a small smile. "Thomas will name it before we do." This was, as it turned out, entirely accurate. The pregnancy moved forward through spring and summer and early fall with no particular difficulty. Wilhelmina continued teaching through May, and then handed the classroom to Mabel for the summer months, which she spent moving more slowly through the work of the ranch and the house, and reading in the afternoons on the porch in what she privately considered one of the finest periods of her life, a season of unhurried industry and deep satisfaction. Samuel was steady with her through all of it. Not hovering, not anxious in any performance of anxiety, but attentive in the specific, practical way that was his primary language of care. He made certain she did not carry heavy things. He came in from the field earlier in the evenings. He sat with her on the porch in the blue hour between afternoon and dark, and they talked about everything and nothing, and were at ease in the silences. Clara read every book she could find that pertained to child-rearing and children's health, and presented Wilhelmina with a written summary of the most important points in a careful hand, which Wilhelmina accepted with complete gravity and thanked her for as she would thank a colleague for a significant piece of research. Thomas had been naming the baby since approximately June. The name changed weekly, cycling through the names of his favorite horses, several historical figures he had encountered in his reading, and at one point a word that was not a name in any language anyone could identify. By September, he had settled on James if it was a boy and Rosalind if it was a girl, which both Wilhelmina and Samuel agreed were reasonable options, though they did not commit. The baby arrived in November, on a cold, bright night with the stars very clear above the Texas flat land, and was a boy, healthy and loud, with his father's dark hair and his mother's mouth, and a certain quality of intensity in his first look at the world that suggested he would have opinions about things from an early age. They named him Eli, for Samuel's father, because despite the complicated nature of that man, the land and the life that they were all living had come from his work and his stubbornness, and there was a rightness in the acknowledgement. Thomas, informed the next morning, looked at the baby for a long time with a very serious expression and then said, "He looks like he's thinking about something." This was taken as high praise from Thomas. Clara held her brother in the careful way of someone who understood the weight of what they were holding, and was very quiet for a while, and then said to Wilhelmina, with the particular directness that was her most consistent quality, "Mother would have been glad." She said it simply, as a factual statement, not as a complicated emotional offering. Wilhelmina received it in the same spirit. "I believe she would have been," she said. The years that followed were full years, years of the kind of accumulating life that does not make good dramatic telling because it is too large and too varied and too woven to be summarized, but which is, in the experience of it, the best thing there is. Eli grew from a thoughtful infant into a small boy with a particular fascination with the natural world, with insects and birds and the behavior of clouds, who asked questions of such specificity that Wilhelmina was frequently required to write to Harriet Crane for help finding the right books. He was, from a very early age, interested in knowing how things worked. Thomas, by the time he was 15, was as capable a ranch hand as any of the men Samuel employed, and had in addition an instinct for the mechanical improvements that the 1880s were beginning to offer, the new equipment and tools that could change the work of a cattle operation if you understood how to use them. Samuel watched his son with a quiet pride that he did not always express in words, but which was visible to anyone who cared to look. Clara, at 17, was the best-read person in Haskell County, and possibly in a much larger radius. She had exhausted what the lending library could offer her, and was corresponding with a women's college in the East that offered a program for exceptional students. Wilhelmina had been the one to first write to the college on her behalf, and Samuel had looked at the college's response, which was an invitation for Clara to apply formally, and had held it for a moment with an expression that was equal parts pride and the particular bittersweet quality of a father who can see very clearly that his daughter is going to be larger than the place he built for her. "She can go," he had said, simply. "If she wants it, we'll find the means." She wanted it. The means were found. The day Clara left for the East, on the morning post wagon to Abilene and then the train north, the family stood together in the yard in the early light, and there were embraces, and Clara, who rarely cried, cried thoroughly. Thomas told her he expected letters on a regular schedule. Eli, who was 5, presented her with a carefully selected beetle in a small jar, which he explained was for studying, and Clara accepted it with complete seriousness and put it in her traveling bag. Samuel held his daughter for a long time, and when he let her go his face was very composed and very full at the same time, the face of a man who has built something that is now going out into the world to do what it was built to do. Wilhelmina stood beside him and took his hand as the wagon rolled away down the Driftwood Creek Road, and he held her hand tightly without looking away from the road until the wagon was a small shape in the distance. "She is going to do remarkable things," Wilhelmina said. "Yes," he said, "she is." They stood like that for a moment, and then Eli tugged at Wilhelmina's other hand and wanted to know if beetles in the eastern states were similar to Texas beetles or structurally different, and the morning reassembled itself around this question as mornings do, practical and forward-moving, and full. In the winter of 1889, Wilhelmina discovered she was expecting again. She told Samuel in the kitchen in the early morning the same way she had told him 3 years before, simply and directly, over her tea. He looked at her the same way too, setting his coffee down, taking her hands. And then he said something he had not said the first time, something that came from the accumulated weight of the years between then and now. "I love you," he said. "I want to say it plainly without anything attached to it, just that. I love you." She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who did not say things he did not mean, whose love she had watched over 4 years of marriage be made tangible in 1,000 practical ways, in rooftop shingles and late porch evenings in a turquoise ring, and the letter he had written to a college on their daughter's behalf, and in the steady, unhurried way he had come toward her across the years from that first careful, guarded morning on the fence. "I love you," she said back. "I have for a very long time." This second child was a girl born in the late summer of 1890, when Texas was dry and hot, and the Creek land was doing exactly the work it had always been meant to do, keeping the cattle alive through the hardest months. They named her Frances, for Wilhelmina's grandmother, a woman she had loved very much. Frances arrived in the world with a certain stubbornness immediately apparent in the vigor of her first few hours, and she grew into a small girl with her father's jaw and her mother's clear eyes, who had strong opinions about everything from the age of 2 onward, and who Cody Marsh, holding her on his knee one afternoon when she was 3, declared to be the most formidable individual of her approximate size he had ever encountered. This was taken as the compliment it was intended to be. Eli, who was 9 when Frances was born, and who had been paying close attention to the natural world for as long as anyone could remember, made a careful observational record of his sister's first weeks in the manner of a naturalist documenting a new discovery, which Wilhelmina found in his drawer years later, and which was one of the funniest and most tender documents she had ever read. The Trask ranch expanded in those years, not aggressively, not in the way of men who acquired land out of hunger rather than purpose, but sensibly, in the ways that made the operation more sustainable and the land itself more respected. Samuel brought in new grazing practices he had read about, rotating the cattle through the pastures to let the grass recover, a practice that some of his neighboring ranchers thought unnecessary, and which resulted in noticeably better land quality within 3 years. He was not a man who needed to be told he was right in order to do the right thing. Cody Marsh married a woman named Alina in 1887, a widow who ran the eating house in Driftwood Creek and who was practical and funny and warm, and Samuel and Wilhelmina attended the wedding and danced and were glad, and from that point forward the two families were knit together in the close, unshowy way that frontier families knit together through work and time and shared knowledge of each other's actual lives. Cody continued as ranch foreman. Samuel trusted him completely. Wilhelmina was particularly fond of Alina, and they became close friends in the specific way that two capable women become friends when they recognize in each other the same quality of mind that the world around them tends not to fully credit. Thomas grew into a man who was deeply capable and deeply good, who inherited his father's stubbornness and his mother's analytical quality, and who combined these with his own particular practical intelligence to become, by his early 20s, one of the better ranch managers in Haskell County. He was not in a hurry about love, and Wilhelmina did not push him, having her own strong memories of the value of coming to it in your own time and not someone else's. He eventually met a girl named Hannah from a farming family in the next county, quiet and sharp-minded and very good at making Thomas stop talking and start listening, which was a skill he needed, and they married when Thomas was 24 and Hannah was 22, and settled into a life that suited them both exactly. Letters came regularly from Clara, long, detailed, fascinating letters about her studies and her professors and the other women at the college who were extraordinary and various, and about the ideas she was encountering and the arguments she was having and the books she was reading. She came home for Christmas every second year and filled the house with the kind of intellectual energy that made Eli, who was growing into a young man of considerable intelligence himself, light up in a way that made Wilhelmina think about the particular gift of being challenged by someone who loved you. Clara eventually pursued medicine. She had, in her careful, methodical way, decided that the place where her skills and the world's needs most precisely overlapped was in medicine, specifically in the care of women and children, and she pursued this with the same combination of clarity and stubbornness that had characterized her since childhood. Wilhelmina supported her completely and wrote her long, careful letters about what she remembered from the days before germ theory was understood, and what she hoped the next decade would bring. And Samuel, whose education in these matters was ongoing and absorbed through his wife and his daughter with equal attention, provided the financial support and the steadfast parental pride that was his particular form of love. In the fall of 1895, the whole family assembled at the Trask Ranch for the first time in 2 years. Clara came from the east. Thomas and Hannah came from their farm with their infant son, a solemn-faced boy named Eli for his grandfather, which caused a brief period of nominal confusion that the family found amusing. Eli, who was 14, and in the middle of deciding what he wanted to do with his considerable brain, was by turns extremely engaged and extremely bored, which was the normal condition of a bright 14-year-old boy. Frances, who was 5, was in a phase of refusing to wear her hair in any arrangement that did not resemble a bird's nest, which Wilhelmina had decided not to fight on the grounds that there were larger battles ahead. They sat at the big kitchen table that had expanded over the years with extra leaves, all of them together in the lamplight, and the noise was considerable, and the food was plentiful, and the conversation went in a dozen directions at once, and Wilhelmina sat at her end of the table and looked down its length at Samuel at the other end, and he caught her eye and held it for a moment. In that look was everything the two of them had built together. The school and the fence line and the letter to Harriet Crane and the lantern on the porch, and the night he had asked her to marry him, and the morning they had named their son, and the afternoon they had watched their daughter's wagon go down the road into the future, and all the ordinary, unremarkable days between those moments that were the actual substance of a life. The mornings and the suppers and the repairs and the disagreements and the laughter and the long evenings on the porch watching the Texas sky do what it did, which was be enormous and full and uncontained. She raised her glass slightly toward him. He raised his slightly toward her. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said, and the table was too loud for quiet words anyway. But the look was clear and entire and held nothing back. After supper, when the children were in various states of settling and Thomas and Hannah had retired to the guest room, and Clara was reading in the parlor and Eli was in his room doing something that involved a great deal of quiet concentration, Samuel and Wilhelmina sat on the porch in the October dark with their coffee. The air was cool and dry, and the stars were the enormous, overwhelming kind that you got in the Texas Panhandle when the sky was clear, and the nearest city was far enough away to let the dark be dark. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, the same gesture as 100 other evenings, worn smooth with use, entirely natural, entirely right. "When Cody told me you had been watching me," she said after a while, "I stood at that fence line for a long time trying to decide what to do with the information." He made a small sound that was nearly a laugh. "I know, he told me." She lifted her head to look at him. "He told you. About a week after he told you. He came to me in the barn and said he had spoken to you and he expected I would fire him and he was prepared to accept that." A pause. "I did not fire him, clearly. I told him he was an interfering nuisance," Samuel said, and that if he had not said something I would probably have spent another 2 years making excuses to myself." He looked down at her with the clear, unguarded expression that was still her favorite thing to find on his face, "and that I was grateful." She settled back against him. The stars above them were countless and various. "A good man, Cody Marsh," she said. "The best I know," Samuel agreed. "After present company." She smiled into the dark. "That is a very smooth thing to say." "I meant it simply," he said, in his manner of meaning things simply. She believed him. She had learned over these years to take him entirely at his word, which was not naive because he was not a man who said things carelessly. It was one of the particular gifts of being loved by someone who did not perform, who told you the actual truth because they had no interest in telling you anything else. It required you, eventually, to believe it. To stop looking for the hidden motive or the conditional clause or the trap concealed in the kind word. She had believed him. She believed him now. The night went on around them. The ranch was quiet. The animals settled. The house full behind them of the warm life they had made together. Somewhere down the road, the town of Driftwood Creek was doing what small frontier towns did in the evening, which was exist with a particular humble solidity, the sum of all the people living their ordinary lives in proximity and occasional community. Wilhelmina Wells, who had come west on a train with $43 and a letter of employment and a particular specific loneliness, and who had crossed a fence line every morning for 2.5 years with her water buckets and her careful, defended heart, thought about the certainty she had built around herself, the architectural-grade certainty that Samuel Trask did not notice her, and found that she could not be anything but grateful for the moment it had been dismantled by a ranch hand. On a Wednesday afternoon in April, over a fence line, she thought about the particular comedy of Providence, the way the things that most completely changed your life were sometimes the smallest and most unlikely actions. A man on a horse saying a few plain words to a woman with 2 buckets. She thought about what would not have happened if Cody Marsh had decided it was not his business, which he would have been technically correct to decide. She thought about Clara and the East changing medicine, about Thomas and Hannah and their solemn new son, about Eli asleep upstairs dreaming of whatever 14-year-olds dreamed of when they were at the start of becoming who they were going to be, about Frances in her bird's nest hair who would, Wilhelmina was quite certain, be whatever she wanted to be and possibly several things simultaneously. She thought about Samuel's arm around her shoulders and the particular reliable weight of it after all these years. "Thank you," she said quietly into the night. He looked down at her. "For what?" "For being the kind of man Cody Marsh was willing to risk his job for," she said. "For being worth the telling." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking about something rather than simply pausing. Then, "You made it easy to be," he said. "Everything you have given me and these children. You made it easy to be worth something." She shook her head slightly. "You were worth something before I ever crossed that yard." "Perhaps," he said, "but I didn't know it." She understood this. She understood the particular power of being known by someone who saw you clearly and found you worth the effort. She had given this to him, she supposed, and he had given it to her, the same thing reflected back in both directions, which was perhaps what love was in its most fundamental structure. Not a feeling that arrived complete from outside, but a knowledge that 2 people constructed between themselves through time and honesty, and the willingness to be seen. The stars continued to be enormous, and the night continued to be quiet, and Samuel Trask's arm continued to be exactly where it was. And Wilhelmina Wells, who had become Wilhelmina Trask some 11 years prior, and who carried both names in her heart with equal weight, closed her eyes for a moment and breathed the October air and was, in every verifiable and substantial sense of the word, home. In the years that followed, Driftwood Creek continued to grow and change as the frontier gave way, slowly and not always gently, to something more settled. The 1890s brought a different quality to the Texas Panhandle, more families, more permanence, the rough edges of the early frontier life smoothing somewhat though never disappearing entirely. The school that Wilhelmina had come to in 1882 became, by 1896, a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms and 3 teachers, and a library that was the pride of the county. She had been its principal teacher, and then its principal for the past 5 years, and it was the work of her professional life in the fullest sense. She stepped back from full-time teaching in 1898, when she was 40 years old and Francis was 8, and still requiring a great deal of the particular attentive parenting that Francis required, which was not the supervision kind but the engaged intellectual partnership kind. She continued to work with the school board in an advisory capacity and to mentor the younger teachers, and she kept her lending library stocked and running, and continued to be the person in Driftwood Creek to whom you went when you needed someone to think clearly about a difficult problem. This was, she had come to accept, simply a role she occupied in the world, the person whose mind could hold a problem steady and turn it in the light until the right angle appeared. Samuel was 52 in 1904, when Thomas took over the management of the main cattle operation, and Samuel found himself in the unfamiliar and initially uncomfortable position of being the elder, the man with the experience who was consulted rather than the man making the daily decisions. He adjusted to this with less difficulty than Wilhelmina had expected, partly because he found that watching Thomas make good decisions was genuinely satisfying, and partly because the reduction in physical responsibility freed him to do something he had always wanted to do and never had time for, which was to properly learn what he was doing with the land. He became, in his 50s, a reader. Not of novels, though he had come to appreciate a good novel through years of listening to Wilhelmina discuss them, but of agricultural science and land management, and the emerging literature on conservation practices. He corresponded with researchers in Austin, and with one or two people as far away as the Department of Agriculture in Washington. He became, in a quiet way, one of the more knowledgeable men in Haskell County on the subject of how to keep land healthy rather than just productive, and this knowledge spread through the community in the gradual osmotic way that good practices spread when the person who holds them is willing to share. Cody Marsh retired from active ranch work in 1902, his knees having decided that a career's worth of time on horseback had exacted a specific physical toll. He and a leaner moved to a smaller house at the edge of the Trask property, a house that Samuel had quietly made available to them years before the official occasion of its being needed, and they became the kind of elder presence in the life of the ranch and the family that was worth more than could be calculated. Francis grew up to be exactly what Wilhelmina had predicted, which was formidable and various. She had her mother's analytical mind and her father's physical fearlessness, and a completely individual capacity for friendship that meant she knew everyone in 3 counties and was genuinely known by all of them. She went to a teacher's college in Abilene at 18, not because she intended to teach, but because it was the most direct available path to the education she wanted, and she came back to Driftwood Creek 2 years later with a certificate and a much broader set of interests, and a particular intention to do something about the fact that the Apache children in the county were still receiving an inferior quality of education to white children, which was an injustice that had troubled Wilhelmina from her first year of teaching, and which Francis approached with the combination of her mother's methodical research and her own particular social gift for making people feel that change was both possible and obviously correct. Wilhelmina helped her. She knew the territory, the legal arguments and the moral ones, the places where pressure could be applied and the people who had the authority to apply it. Between them, mother and daughter wrote letters and attended meetings and argued cases in front of the school board and the county commission, and eventually the state education department. And the changes they achieved were not everything they wanted, but they were real and permanent, and they moved the needle toward something more just, and that was worth the years it took. Eli became a botanist. He moved to Austin, then to San Francisco, then spent several years in South America studying plant species, and sent letters home full of detailed descriptions of things he was seeing that made Wilhelmina read them aloud to Samuel in the evenings, and both of them, feel that the world was considerably larger and more extraordinary than the Texas Panhandle had led them to fully appreciate, though the Panhandle was extraordinary enough. He was a happy young man, living exactly the life he was built for, and this was everything a mother could want from a son. On a clear October morning in 1905, Samuel and Wilhelmina Trask sat on their porch with their coffee, a habit of some 20 years standing. The mesquite trees along the north fence had gone gold with the season. The air was the particular dry cold of a Texas autumn, clean and clarifying. The creek bed in the distance was still green from the late summer rains. They had been talking about Francis's latest effort with the school board, which had gone well, and then they had been quiet, the comfortable quiet of two people who have said enough over the years to be able to rest in its absence. "Do you remember the first time we talked?" Wilhelmina asked. "Really talked, on the porch that morning." Samuel thought back. "About the land claim. You asked me why I would do that," she said, "why I would help. And you said because it was the right thing." He looked at her. "I always thought there was more to it than that." "There was," she said, "but the right thing was true as well." He smiled. "I know." He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had covered with his at the fence line more than 20 years ago, the one with the turquoise ring he had put there on a November night with the stars very clear above them. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." "There are people who spend their whole lives waiting to be seen," he said carefully, "and then spend equal time unable to believe it when someone finally sees them. I was both of those people." She looked at him. "You saw me," she said, "long before Cody told me. You saw me every morning." "I did," he said. "I just couldn't believe you would want that to be true." She turned his hand over in hers and looked at it, the roughness of it, the reliable solidity of it, and thought about all the mornings it had been warm over hers since the beginning. "Believing it," she said, "was the best decision I ever made." He raised her hand and pressed it to his lips, the gesture of a man who had learned over 20 years that love was not a performance or a declaration, but a sustained and daily act of showing up, of choosing, of staying present to what was real. She felt the warmth of it move through her with all the accumulated weight of the years behind it. Every supper and every storm and every child born into their care, and every fence line walked, and every letter written, and every long evening on this porch watching the enormous Texas sky. The sun came up over the flat land, as it always did, patient and indifferent to the small human dramas below it, the same sun that had lit the dust of the yard the morning Wilhelmina Wells had first crossed it with her water buckets and her careful heart. She had been certain then that he did not notice her. She smiled into the morning light at the irrevocable sweetness of having been wrong. The ranch was quiet around them. The cattle were somewhere in the south pasture. The creek ran over its stones in the dry season silence. Somewhere in the house Francis was waking up, which meant within the hour she would have opinions about breakfast, and Thomas would be arriving by 9 with some question about the north herd, and Cody might ride over from his house in the afternoon, because he claimed his hip told him when rain was coming, and he wanted to discuss the prospect. The world was fully and completely itself. And Wilhelmina Trask, who had come west 23 years ago on a train with $43 and a letter, and a longing she had not known how to name, sat in the October morning with her coffee and her husband's hand, and the whole accumulated richness of the life they had built in this red dirt, wide sky, demanding and beautiful country, and was everything she had ever needed to be. Alive.